to our second Spotlight interview series, which is the INGSA-Asia's inaugural series, where we'll be conducting a series of interviews with INGSA-Asia steering committee members who are leaders in their own right, and will be focusing on a myriad of topics ranging from the sustainability of electrical vehicles to switching career paths as a scientist or researchers, as well as how can we better influence this whole space of knowledge brokerage of the science, policy, and society interface. And really, this showcase interviews are meant to spotlight the diverse expertise and lived experiences of our steering committee members. And today, we have Dr. Anders Karlsson, the Vice President of the Global Strategic Networks at Elsevier, Japan, and the Chair of the Japan chapter of the International Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers, STM. Dr. Anders has had an illustrious career. He has been a visiting scientist at NTT Basic Research Labs at Stanford University, École Polytechnique Paris, and Zhejiang University, as well as a senior advisor at Osaka University. Dr. Karlsson has a background in science diplomacy, having headed the embassy of the Swedish Office of Science and Innovation in Tokyo, and also an academic. He used to be the Professor of Quantum Photonics at the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, in Sweden. So we have an amazing wealth of experience here in Dr. Anders, and we are extremely grateful that you are here to share with us some of your thoughts on your journey as you transition from academia to government and now industry, and to at least help share with our audience today a couple of questions that I will be asking you. Welcome, Dr. Anders.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhi. It's an honor to be here indeed, and so exciting to work with the INGSA and INGSA-Asia chapter, because I believe the mission and the work you're doing and what we are doing is very much supporting to bridge. I like the way you use the word knowledge brokerage. So looking forward to our discussion today, and it's always a pleasure to discuss with you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start with, I guess, the obvious question. Not many people have had such an illustrious career spanning across, the academia, government, and industry. So could you perhaps share with us, some of your thoughts regarding the similarities and the differences in the roles that you have had in each of these sectors? And throughout these years, have you seen an increase in engagement and collaboration between these stakeholders? And ultimately, how is this relationship impacting the public policy and society?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. It's a bit of a challenging one on one hand, because all of us have our personal journey, and some of this may be commonalities, and other things are more by random chance, I should say. So a bit to start on, to wind it up a bit, to start with difference academia, government, and industries, similarities and differences. I would say there are many differences, but also quite many similarities. I do think, although I work in industry right now, but I work in Elsevier, which is very particular in the sense that we are working very closely, very often with academia. And I think maybe there are even as many PhDs as there are MBAs in Elsevier in that sense. So on a daily basis, we're having questions and discussions with academics on how to support the academic enterprise. So with that caveat emptor, so to speak, but about differences, I think, first of all, in industry, especially when coming into a large company, you often work in quite a big matrix structure, and there are complex dependencies on everything you want to do. So it's really important to be able to network that environment and getting buy-in for ideas. That's really, really important. And although the title Vice President may sound very fancy in that sense, I don't have a large team, but I do believe with the work we can do in the team and being able to bring together people from other departments, we can achieve quite a lot in that sense. Another difference I find a bit comparing academia and government, even though academia is becoming quite metrics driven in many ways, both good and bad ways, I should say. I do believe that in industry, you have often quite clear end in minds and definitions of success. Even in our team, which is really about building networks with research leaders and work in strategic projects and collaborations, such as INGSA, we do still have, we're still being measured in the sense of those we're working with, how do we support them? And does it ultimately in the end support the company? That's clear. Those in sales role, I don't have a sales role, they have even stricter targets and very regular follow-ups. Still, I do have to say that Elsevier in this perspective, being quite close to academia, is also very long-term focused in that sense. So those are some of the differences. But there are similarities in many ways. So first of all, the similarities between what I do now in industry and the embassy role, in the sense that I got into the company in a role that kind of fitted well with having worked in science diplomacy. And much of this has to do with trust building and supporting collaborations. So that's very similar to the governmental role. But again, working in government, as you would know, you also have to build networks, and you have to find the avenues where what you write or what you talk about, it influences and impacts in the right parts of organization.
Okay.
That is not, in some sense, different from academia. And one may think that academia is working quite lonely as a scientist, right? But it's not so. And increasingly not so, that you're working very much often, I find, now that I'm no longer in academia, right? But those I meet, I'm honored to meet, more and more are working in teams, in larger teams, because many of the questions that are asked, even if you bring in your speciality, will be to work in a team for solving something in on a larger issue.
Sure.
Be it around one of the sustainable development goals. It's also so that more often we see large project grants where you need to bring together teams. So again, those are the similarities. Academics, of course, as all know, we all depends upon our peers, our mentors, and other colleagues in the system, so to speak. So those who are successful are often those that are both brilliant in their own field, but also see the bigger picture and can connect with other colleagues, both in the university and outside.
Great.
So does it help to answer in that sense?
It does. And I think, first of all, I just want to say, I don't think, an individual's leadership should be measured by the size of his team, but actually the impact that you create. And I've seen, how you reach out, to so many different actors out there and actually to facilitate them and get involved. And I think that's really important. And you, I think, brought up a very important key here, which is trust. And we know that there is this huge trust deficit that exists across, various different stakeholders. And it's really, really important that we bridge this trust deficit. I just want to expand a little bit from what you said regarding the need for an appreciation that the academics of today really are involved in interdisciplinary dialogues. And when the grand challenges require this interdisciplinarity, actually the academics are challenged to work, with other individuals from various different disciplines. But there still remains, and I think not unjustifiably, this perception that academics still will fall back very quickly into their echo chambers. And it's always a little bit more comfortable, right? So even when we talk about interdisciplinary teams, a lot of it is from different disciplines within the academic circle, where the focus is still about publications, the focus is still about whatever measures, you know, that ultimately will help with their professional advancement or visibility. But you have, of course, broken from that mold. I mean, you have done it, you have achieved as an academic, then gone on to do in science diplomacy, and now as an industry leader trying to support that scientific ecosystem.
Yeah.
So if there was, you know, an advice on how academics should play a greater proactive role, especially in the context of the science advice, what would it be?
Yeah. Well, again, it's quite a big picture, a big question. So, so first of all, as an academic, you are by definition curious, but to stay curious, and I do like the Steve Jobs quote saying, "Stay foolish, stay hungry," right? So, on one hand, science can often be quite lonely, especially as a young scientist, because you're getting into the area, you have to go deep in your studies. On the other hand, I believe it's very important, and I'm not saying I was good at that earlier on, is to early on broaden the network beyond the own group. And in doing that, it's not just within the own research group, but also outside. And if there are opportunities to, for instance, enroll in a mentor program, that's a good advice, I believe. The second thing I have kind of, I should say, learned the hard way is that in academia, we are quite often also project managers, but very often we learn by doing, right? So to get skill sets around project management, I believe is quite important. The third piece there, again, to the more broader role is around science communication. This is useful not only while you're in academia, because you have to pitch your project not only to your team, but quite often in competition with those who are not experts in your own area. And therefore, it's important to be able to communicate why this project is important in the broader context so others can understand as well. I was on my side, to be a bit personal in this sense, I was extremely fortunate, I should say, that one of Swedish funding agencies, they set up a program which now is in the 7th generation, and it's called Future Research Leaders, because they realized that there were many brilliant young scientists who then all of a sudden grew their group and needed the kind of skill sets to manage larger groups and also be effective in how to communicate, get the grants, etc. So at that time, we were 20 who got this grant. And this included, besides funding for postdocs and so forth, like 6 weeks of training on project management, science policy, and politics. The grant at that time was called INGVAR, mentioned, named after one of former prime ministers and ministers of higher education and research, who actually came to our meetings to speak about the advice on policy. We had heads of funding agency and so on. And it also included 2 weeks in Japan, which is when I found out that this role of science counselor could be quite interesting as a knowledge broker and so forth. But the program also included these pieces around both project management and media training, science communication. And I believe getting these pieces in there relatively early can be quite useful for younger scientists. It may not seem, oh, this is not useful for my thesis work, but everyone will hopefully have a long career to follow.
Yeah.
So all of these things are useful. And to go back to Steve Jobs, in that sense, you make the dots connect.
Great.
Sorry.
No, I agree, and I think thanks for this insight. I think giving that example that you had in Sweden, really focusing on the way we are training our scientists, right? I mean, and also equipping them with resources beyond the technical skills or the cognitive skills that we think are usually captured in a thesis or your publications. And three things: it's project management, people management, as well as communication. So that's great. Now, you just gave us an example of what you were involved in, or at least was introduced in Sweden. And I think for many of us in the Asia region, especially within the Southeast Asia or South Asia, we look upon countries like Japan and Sweden, two countries that you have had the opportunity to work in, as really the bastions of developed countries, championing the sustainability agenda, societies that certainly have really transformed over the years and really lead the way in the way we imagine the future will be. Of course, during the pandemic, it was revealed that even countries like Sweden and Japan have fundamental gaps in their science advice capacity, in the ability to respond, especially when there are so many uncertainties. Having said that, there's still a lot to be learned, and a lot that I think we can learn from each other. From your time that you have been in Japan, could you maybe share with us some of the things that are being done that you feel that many countries could also emulate, both Japan or Sweden? I know we have stalwarts like Arimoto-san or Reiko Kurada, who are amazing, drivers of the science advice and also the agenda of inclusivity. But Dr. Anders, maybe you could share with us some examples of experiences that you have seen in Sweden and Japan, which we can learn from.
Yeah, okay, so starting a bit with Japan. So first of all, I'm not an historian of science, and I have to be very humble to say that I don't know all the details around the post-war development in Japan to comment. But if I go to the most recent, let's say 20 years or so, it's quite interesting. Japan started with a kind of a 5-year planning cycle. They put in a basic science technology plan saying that this should be a top priority. There is a council called the Council for Science, Technology and Innovation, which basically is led by the Prime Minister, have all the ministers in there, and then works as a control tower, basically. And now they have also introduced annual innovation strategies. And that kind of sets a goal. And I do know that Malaysia, I do know many other countries have similar, but that mechanism, I believe, has been quite useful to understand directions. So in Japan right now, there are lots of discussions around what you call Society 5.0, which is to go beyond Industry 4.0 to put the human element into the society we want. And that kind of helps a bit on shaping where policies are. That stated, Japan has around 75% or so of science, technology and innovation, R&D investment done by the industry. So government can do to some extent and give directions, but also industry is extremely important. So Japan recently introduced a formal science advisor to the cabinet just recently, but they do have had this council for a long time, where actually this has helped to bring up the science and technology high on the agenda. And this is very important because we live in a knowledge society where the contributions from universities on one hand, government institutes and industry are very important. So it's very important that science, technology and innovation is high on the agenda. If I go back to Sweden, on one hand, there is no formal science advisor position at government level, which during the pandemic, it's a bit controversial to say this, but there was even the case when someone asked the Prime Minister about this, should there only be your advice taken from one expert authority? Shouldn't there be someone else also giving opinion? And he was basically saying, well, if I have several people giving all of this advice, or two, who should I trust? But there are many who felt that there was the need for a bit of second opinion in terms of a science advice. That stated, the government for a long time have had various policy advisory committees, and it's a small country, people know each other, so it's working in many ways very well. That stated. It also have had for quite some time, I'm not sure if they still have it, where actually there were regular meetings with government and industry representatives as well. Even though you had a social democratic, not socialist, but social democratic government, there still was these consensus meetings done. So the word consensus and trust, I think, would go very high up in any good developments for society, because when you have trust in discussions, you go much further. So the case of Sweden is a society where the level of societal trust is quite high, very high, I should say. And it's also why some of the kind of policy advice during the pandemic were kind of loose. There were recommendations, but people knew how to interpret these recommendations because there was the high level of civic trust. So trust, again, is very, very important. And how do you get trust? Transparency is one piece of that, for instance. So anyway, that was a long
No,
answer.
it's fantastic.
I hope it
Thank
helped
you.
you.
And I'm fully aware that I was being very unfair to ask you to summarize the history of science of both countries. But what I really wanted to get out was your personal perspectives, in recent times, and I think you really captured that. I was very lucky when I first heard the 5.0 Society 5.0 was revealed, and really it's a fantastic ideology, right? And a reminder that despite advances, that is coming with the fourth industrial revolution, what matters is how are humans going to be, responding and living with these technologies. And this whole idea of Society 5.0, really it's about humanizing. And I think that's important. And the question that you then brought up, right? How can we build that trust? Transparency is number one, but also I think what Sweden has is not just trust, but also the fact that you have a high level of education, and an education system that also provides for a society that is a little bit more informed, and then can make those decisions based on the knowledge that's actually provided. But I'm gonna, take the word transparent now, and I think obviously a world in which everybody is an expert today. And usually this refers to the keyboard warriors that are out there, who justifiably also have the opinions, and because of social media and the internet, now their voices are also given equal weightage, or sometimes disproportionately more to perhaps the previous purveyors of knowledge. So especially coming from the publishing industry, and I know that you really advocate the need for more open and transparent science, within the scientific community as well as to the public, especially in the context of recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. One of the biggest battles that we had to have is because of this issue of fake news. A lot of it's arising from the communication of science directly through various different open access platforms, and of course the associated risks. So as the publishing industry response to ensure research continues to be more accessible and widely available. What are the challenges or maybe opportunities or some of the things that is keeping you awake every night, Dr. Anders, and is driving your team to ensure that the publishing industry also institutionalizes or institutes the necessary safeguards to ensure that the open science movement or the drive ultimately achieves that goal of positive impact?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think it keeps me awake at night, but I do think as a start, it's quite amazing what the digital technologies have allowed us to do in terms of sharing information and increasingly building advanced platforms. And science is transformed also by artificial intelligence more and more. And in that sense, what do somehow keep me, if not awake at night, but is that we can have the dialogue between all parties, because I do think that industry, with the innovation done by industry, listening to the academia, to government, is a key element there, and that industry is involved in these discussions. So that's part of the digital infrastructure in some sense. The second piece, which relates to look, what happened during the pandemic is a huge success of science in so many ways, because you managed to accelerate bringing in knowledge on the mRNA development, for instance. No, I'm not from medicine, so I just know the term.
I'll make sure I
bring
correct
that in. Yes, to bring that in, and then accelerate that to actually having vaccines. And this was helped quite a lot, for instance, via the sharing of data, which again is possible due to infrastructure. The other element of it, which as industry we do in case of global health emergencies, right now it was it still is the COVID-19, you had the monkeypox right now, is to basically open up that content. And we actually built platforms specifically for that. We also used AI in our case to quickly identify articles which would be relevant for around the pandemic. And all that is only possible if there is a kind of sustainable model behind somehow. And figuring that out, how this sustainable model moving forward with industry, with academia, still in an open way, is one of the things that we are working on as an industry. And we are, again, science advice, I need to declare a conflict of interest. I work for this company you see there in the logo. So what you hear is the corporate pitch in that sense. So we are one of the largest open access publishers, for instance, right now. But figuring out with academia how the model should be, moving forward, is one of the things. The other thing which I do think is very important is that we also have to think through how we evaluate researchers, how we actually do it in a way that it helps to drive towards societal impact. And somehow this is going to moving away from the just publish or perish to something which is more collaborative. And that goes back to a dialogue with academia, because you in academia are in charge of how you evaluate your researchers. And we must be mindful in the tools we provide and the explanation of those tools, so they are used in a good way, let's put it like that. And this is something I quite often have discussions with in that there's a misuse of this so-called impact factor. for instance, and let us not go into that discussion.
Well,
We
I
can
want to
go on for
invite you again
hours.
to discuss that, because that alone, I think, is extremely important. You know, and it's really, to a certain extent, has been useful in some ways, but has also totally hijacked that purpose of science.
Yes.
And I like your reminder that, you know, the societal impact, right? And especially you've got your big, bold, building a sustainable future behind you. I think it doesn't matter that you come from industry, and you can say Elsevier, it's fine, because ultimately we will not be able to drive things if we all did not have interests. The question is, how do we manage those conflicts of interest to ensure that the common interest of greater good is actually achieved? And I think that's really important. Sorry, I kind of interrupted you in your mid-sentence. I also get excited when we talk about impact factor. But I realized that you had something else to add on with regards to you know, things. So you talked about the technologies and how it's driving that open science. The second thing is, how do we evaluate scientists? And you were going to say something else.
Yeah, I was going to bring up, we just recently, Economist Impact, together with, supported by us, did a global survey of researchers on how science have kind of changed during the pandemic. And one thing that came up, which goes back to your word of trust, is quite actually the importance of peer review in this respect. That scientific information really affects lives. And you would know that so much from your own background, in that we need trusted science. And one way we are having that is through the mechanism of peer review, which may take many forms, but it's still a manual check by peers on that the science going out is checked, so to speak. And that in some sense it's not a challenge, but in some sense it can have been a challenge during pandemic, because we wanted replies. We wanted science to support fast, and we're eager to know. Society was eager to know, how can science help? So that's a good thing on one hand, but there's a risk of when things go too fast. And that's why the role of scientists in actually in the community checking that the things going out is trusted and can be used, because otherwise it can have bad effect on lives. So sorry for a long addition on that one.
No, I think extremely important, and I think I can see where this is coming from. You know, and when you think about this whole trust deficit, we can easily blame the publishing industry, but I think this is where when scientists understand that they have that important role, that ultimately, you know, how fast, you know, what is the trade-off with how safe, right? And really ultimately, you know, we do have that collective responsibility, and I think you did capture that very, very clearly. I know we're coming to the end of our interview today, and I know that there's so many things that I wish that we had time to dissect. But I guess my last question to you, if you had one advice to young viewers, you know, or perhaps not so young viewers who are looking at you and going, wow, Professor Anders Karlsson has transcended, you know, all three of these big, you know, domains of academia, industry, and government, and has actually been, you know, at the highest levels to a certain extent. What would your advice be?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I feel a bit embarrassed when you praise so much, because it's partly a piece of chance. But it goes back to this of being curious. And one thing I do feel, as again being quite humble in this respect, what I've learned is that, if there is a learning, is that both in academia, when you work with this government, and now in industry, you will meet a lot of interesting, engaging, smart people. So you will always learn. So I think, although it always takes effort to cross into new areas or change job or whatever, is really to you will always learn new things. That's the thing. And the second thing is, well, actually, to make it very easy to end, I have always tried to the greatest extent to have fun, and also in work, and laugh at times. And it also goes with not taking yourself too much serious at times. But this comes back to the point of curiosity and passion for the work. And anyone young or more senior in this respect, find the things that you find interesting, but also keep a very broad, open eye and speak with many people outside your own area.
Yeah,
if that
great
helps.
I think that really captures it, right? I think, you know, the reason why you've had these opportunities, as you say, it's because you were open to it, and you made yourself available to those opportunities, and that's allowed you to chart yourself. I mean, and who knows, right? You might go back to academia at some point, or you might decide to, you know, go to something else, right? One, you know, we talk about the quadruple helix, Dr. Anders. I mean, the next thing is to perhaps, you know, see yourself as a social advocate and society, and, you know, whatever it is. And maybe you're already doing that, you know, through the organizations that you are. But that's a great reminder, I think, you know, being open to opportunities to learn and to keep yourself, the more aware you are of what people need, the more in need you become. And that's the whole idea of supply and demand when we talk about science advice and knowledge brokerage. Dr. Anders, I'm really sorry that we don't have much more time to have this amazing sharing with you, but I think you are extremely humble. You are extremely, you know, engaging, and it's been a joy to have you on the INGSA-Asia Steering Committee member, because, like I said, it's not just the positions that you hold, but it's the actual impact that you create. You never say no whenever I request for voluntary help. You're always there to engage with, you know, researchers and academics from everywhere else. And I think you are the kind of leaders that we need to have more in our region. And for that, I thank you. And I thank all the viewers for joining us in this INGSA-Asia Spotlight interview. And I really hope to see you in our next INGSA-Asia Spotlight.
Thank you very much. And it's an honor to work with INGSA-Asia and with yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.